in the unforgiving Arizona territory of 1847, where survival meant everything, and loyalty was the only currency that mattered, one woman's world would shatter in a single moment of cowardice. When the dust settled and the scream faded, Elena Whitmore would discover that the man she'd trusted with her life, her own husband, would abandon her to die in the desert while she carried his child. But sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the enemy becomes family. This is a story of betrayal, redemption, and the fierce love of a mother who would defy two worlds to protect her child. Stay with me until the end, and please comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels across the globe. The Apache war cry split the morning air like a blade through silk, piercing the tranquil dawn that had promised nothing more dangerous than another day's journey toward California. Elena Whitmore jolted awake in the covered wagon, her hand instinctively moving to the swollen curve of her belly, where their unborn child rested blissfully, unaware of the chaos erupting around them. "Jacob!" she called out, her voice barely audible over the thundering of hooves and the sharp crack of rifle fire. "Jacob, what's happening?" But her husband was already gone from beside her, and through the canvas flap she could see him crouched behind a boulder 30 yards away, his rifle trained on the painted warriors who swept down from the ridge like avenging spirits. The other men of their small wagon train had taken similar positions, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were outnumbered 3-1. Elena struggled to sit up, her pregnancy making every movement awkward and painful. At 7 months, she felt like a ship struggling to navigate rough seas, her center of gravity shifted and unreliable. The baby kicked hard against her ribs as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. "Stay down, Elena," Jacob shouted over his shoulder, not even looking back at her. "Keep your head low." Another volley of arrows whistled overhead, one embedding itself in the wooden frame of their wagon with a solid thunk that made Elena's heart skip. She pressed herself against the flour barrels, trying to make herself as small as possible while protecting her unborn child. The attack had come without warning. They'd been following the established trail toward the Colorado River, their small party of 6 families seeking new opportunities in California's gold fields. Jacob had insisted it was safe. The army had cleared most of the hostile tribes from this area, he'd said, with the confidence of a man who'd never faced a war party in his life. How wrong he'd been. Through the gap in the canvas, Elena watched in horror as Tom Morrison, the wagon train's leader, fell backward with an arrow protruding from his chest. His wife's scream cut through the battle noise like broken glass, raw and desperate. Sarah Morrison crawled toward her fallen husband, seemingly oblivious to the bullets whining overhead. "We need to go," shouted Marcus Fletcher, another settler. "There are too many of them." Elena saw Jacob's head snap up at these words, his eyes wide with panic. For a moment their gazes met across the battleground, and she saw something in his expression that chilled her more than the Apache war cry's, fear so complete it had erased every other consideration, including her. "Jacob," she called out, extending her hand toward him. "Help me down, I can't move fast enough." But Jacob was already backing away, his rifle forgotten, as he scrambled toward the horses they'd picketed behind the wagons. Other men were doing the same. Those who could still move were abandoning the slower members of the party, including the women and children who couldn't match their pace. "Jacob, please!" Elena's voice cracked with desperation as she struggled to climb down from the wagon. Her swollen body betrayed her, and she fell heavily to her knees in the dirt, pain shooting through her back and abdomen. She looked up to see Jacob mounting his horse, his face twisted with something between guilt and terror. Their eyes met for one terrible moment, and she saw him mouth the word, "sorry," before he spurred his horse and galloped away, following the other fleeing men toward the eastern horizon. Elena knelt in the dust, unable to process what had just happened. Her husband, the man who had promised to love and protect her until death, had just abandoned her to die while she carried his child. The Apache warriors were regrouping for another charge. and she was trapped between the burning wagons and certain death. Elena, Sarah Morrison, crawled toward her, her dress soaked with her husband's blood. "We have to hide," but there was nowhere to hide. The wagons offered no real protection, and the open desert stretched endlessly in all directions. Elena felt a sharp pain in her abdomen, whether from fear or the onset of labor, she couldn't tell. The baby inside her seemed to thrash desperately, as if trying to escape the violence surrounding them. An Apache warrior on a painted pony wheeled around the far end of the wagon train, his lance gleaming in the morning sun. Elena closed her eyes and wrapped her arms around her belly, whispering a prayer for her unborn child. If they were going to die, at least they would die together. But the killing blow never came. Instead, she heard a sharp exchange in the Apache language, voices raised in what sounded like argument. When she opened her eyes, she saw two warriors facing each other, their horses prancing nervously. The one with the lance was gesturing toward the huddled women, while the other, an older man with gray streaking his long black hair, shook his head firmly. The argument continued for several moments, while Elena and the other survivors waited in terrified silence. Finally, the older warrior made a sharp gesture, and the younger one lowered his lance. With a series of sharp whistles, the war party began to withdraw, driving the captured horses and whatever supplies they could carry. Within minutes, an eerie silence descended over the massacre site. Elena remained kneeling in the dirt, hardly daring to believe she was still alive. Around her, the remnants of their wagon train smoldered in the morning heat. Of the 6 families who had started this journey, only she, Sarah Morrison, and old Pete Fletcher remained. Everyone else was either dead or had fled with the cowardly men. "Why?" Sarah whispered, cradling her dead husband's head in her lap. "Why did they spare us?" Elena had no answer. She struggled to her feet, one hand pressed against her lower back where a deep ache was beginning to spread. The pain was different from the usual discomfort of pregnancy, sharper, more insistent. As she took a tentative step, she felt something warm trickling down her inner thigh. "No," she whispered, looking down at the spots of blood darkening her dress. "No, not now." But her body had its own agenda. The trauma of the attack, the shock of Jacob's abandonment, and the physical stress of the morning had triggered something that couldn't be stopped. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not. Another contraction gripped her, strong enough to double her over. She gritted her teeth, refusing to cry out. Not here, not in this place of death and betrayal. She had to find shelter, had to find help, had to— Elena! Sarah was beside her, supporting her weight. "What's wrong? The baby?" Elena gasped between contractions. "It's coming!" Sarah's face went white. She was barely more than a girl herself, 19 years old and newly married. She knew nothing about childbirth, especially not under these circumstances. "What do we do? Should we try to find the men?" Elena almost laughed at the bitter irony. "The men are gone, Sarah. They're not coming back." Another contraction tore through her, and she bit her lip until she tasted blood. "We're on our own." Old Pete Fletcher approached them, his weathered face grave. He'd taken an arrow in the shoulder, but he was still mobile. "Ladies, we need to get moving. Those Apache might come back, and we're sitting ducks out here in the open." "Elena can't travel," Sarah said. "She's having the baby." Pete's expression grew even more grim. A baby born out here with no proper shelter, no clean water, no medical supplies. It was a death sentence for both mother and child. But staying put was equally deadly if the war party returned. "There's a spring about 2 miles north," Pete said after a moment, "hidden in some rocks. If we can get her there." Elena nodded, though each movement sent fresh waves of pain through her body. It was their only chance. She couldn't give birth here among the bodies and burning wagons. Her child deserved better than that, even if better meant dying in the shade instead of under the merciless sun. With Sarah and Pete supporting her on either side, Elena began the agonizing journey across the desert. Each step was torture, each contraction brought her closer to collapse. The sun climbed higher, turning the air into a shimmering furnace that seemed to suck the moisture from her lungs. They made it perhaps a mile before Elena couldn't go any further. Her legs gave out and she sank to her knees in the sand, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and pain. "I can't," she gasped. "I can't do it." "And you have to," Sarah pleaded, tears streaming down her dust-stained cheeks. "The baby needs you to be strong." But Elena felt anything but strong. She felt broken, abandoned, and utterly alone. The man she'd loved and trusted had left her to die. Her child would be born in this wasteland, with no father to protect them and no future to look forward to. What was the point of fighting anymore? As if sensing her despair, the baby inside her gave a particularly strong kick, as if to say, "I'm not ready to give up yet." Elena placed both hands on her belly, feeling the life that still moved within her. This child was innocent of their father's cowardice, innocent of the violence that had shattered their world. This child deserved a chance at life, even if Elena couldn't see how to give it one. "Help me up," she whispered. With their assistance, she managed to stand again, and they resumed their painful progress across the desert. The sun was directly overhead now, beating down on them with relentless intensity. Elena's dress was soaked with sweat and blood, and her vision was beginning to blur around the edges. When they finally reached the spring, Pete had mentioned Elena collapsed beside the small pool of clear water with a sob of relief. The shade provided by the overhanging rocks felt like a blessing, and the sound of trickling water was the sweetest music she'd ever heard. But there was no time to rest. The contractions were coming faster now, with barely a minute between them. Elena knew enough about childbirth to realize that her baby would be born soon, ready or not. "Sarah, I need you to help me," Elena said, her voice tight with pain and determination. "Pete, you need to keep watch. If anyone comes Apache or anyone else, you have to warn us." The old man nodded and positioned himself at the mouth of their small shelter, his rifle across his knees. Sarah knelt beside Elena, her young face pale but resolute. "What do I need to do?" Sarah asked. Elena almost smiled despite their circumstances. This girl, who had lost her husband only hours ago, was willing to risk everything to help bring new life into the world. Perhaps there was still good in humanity after all. "First, we need clean water and something to wrap the baby in," Elena said, fighting through another contraction. "Tear up my petticoat. It's the cleanest cloth we have." As Sarah worked to prepare for the birth, Elena found herself thinking about Cowboy again. Where was he now, still running? Had he already convinced himself that she was dead, that his abandonment was somehow justified? The thought filled her with a rage, so pure and bright, it almost overshadowed the physical pain. She would survive this. She would deliver this baby and find a way to build a life for them both. And if she ever saw Jacob Whitmore again, she would make sure he understood exactly what his cowardice had cost them all. Another contraction gripped her stronger than any before, and Elena knew the time for anger would come later. Right now she had to focus on bringing her child safely into this harsh world. "It's coming," she gasped. "Sarah, get ready." The next hour passed in a blur of pain, effort, and desperate hope. Elena pushed when her body demanded, it rested when she could, and tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong. Sarah proved to be a capable assistant despite her inexperience, following Elena's breathless instructions and offering what comfort she could. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Elena felt the familiar sensation of her baby's head crowning. With one final tremendous effort, she pushed her child into Sarah's waiting hands. For a moment, the desert was silent except for Elena's labored breathing. Then a thin, reedy cry echoed off the rock walls, and Elena knew her baby was alive. "It's a girl," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face as she held the tiny, squirming infant. "She's beautiful, Elena." Elena held out her arms, and Sarah placed the baby against her chest. Despite everything they'd been through, the child was perfect. Small but healthy, with a full head of dark hair and lungs that worked perfectly, judging by her indignant cries. "Hello, little star," Elena whispered, using the pet name that had come to her during the long hours of labor. "Welcome to the world." As she held her daughter for the first time, Elena felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her that was stronger than any emotion she'd ever experienced. This child was hers, and she would move mountains to keep her safe. Jacob's abandonment, the Apache attack, the uncertain future that lay ahead, none of it mattered as much as the tiny life in her arms. "What will you name her?" Sarah asked. Elena looked down at her daughter's face, thinking of the way her birth had brought light into this dark day. "Stella," she said softly. "Her name is Stella." As if approving of her new name, the baby's cries quieted, and she opened her eyes for the first time. They were dark and alert, seeming to take in everything around her with an intelligence that was almost unsettling. "She's going to be special," Sarah said, with conviction. "I can tell." Elena nodded, though she wondered what kind of future awaited a child born under such circumstances. They were alone in the desert with limited supplies, no transportation, and no clear destination. Even if they managed to survive the next few days, how could she possibly provide for Stella on her own? But as she held her daughter close, feeling the steady rhythm of the baby's breathing against her chest, Elena made a silent vow. Whatever it took, wherever their path led them, she would find a way to give Stella the life she deserved, a life filled with love, security, and hope for the future. The sun was setting now, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Soon it would be dark and they would face new dangers. But for this moment, in the shelter of the rocks beside the life-giving spring, Elena allowed herself to simply be a mother holding her newborn child. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight it was enough that they were both alive. As darkness fell over the desert, Elena whispered stories to her daughter about the world they would build together. A world where courage mattered more than cowardice, where love was stronger than fear, and where a woman could forge her own destiny, regardless of what men might do to betray her. She didn't know that in the shadows beyond their small shelter, a lone figure watched them with eyes that held both curiosity and an unexpected stirring of compassion. She didn't know that their story was far from over, and that salvation might come from the most unlikely source. All she knew was that she was a mother now, and that changed everything. The first rays of dawn crept across the desert floor like fingers of hope, illuminating the rocky shelter where Elena had spent the night clutching her newborn daughter. Stella had slept fitfully, waking every hour to nurse her tiny fists grasping at the torn fabric of Elena's dress. Each time the baby stirred, Elena's heart clenched with a mixture of fierce love and growing desperation. They had survived the birth, but survival in this wasteland would require more than determination. Sarah Morrison sat propped against the far wall of their shelter, her eyes red-rimmed from crying and sleeplessness. She'd taken the first watch while Elena rested, though rest was a generous term for the fitful dozing that had plagued them both. Old Pete Fletcher lay near the entrance, his wounded shoulder bound with strips torn from Sarah's petticoat, his breathing shallow but steady. "Water's getting low," Pete croaked, nodding toward the small pool that had been their salvation. "Spring's not flowing as strong as it should be for this time of year." Elena looked down at Stella, who was nursing with the desperate hunger of a child born too early into an unforgiving world. The baby's skin had the translucent quality of premature birth, though she seemed healthy enough. Still, Elena knew they couldn't stay here much longer. Without adequate food and clean water, both she and Stella would weaken rapidly. "How far are we from the nearest settlement?" Elena asked, though she dreaded the answer. Pete's weathered face was grim. "Fort Defiance is maybe 40 miles northwest, but that's across some of the roughest territory in the territory. Santa Fe's closer, but—" He trailed off, not needing to finish. Santa Fe meant traveling deeper into Apache territory, and they'd already seen what the war parties were capable of. "We can't stay here," Sarah said quietly. "Sooner or later, someone's going to find us. And if it's not soldiers—" Elena nodded, understanding the unspoken threat. The Apache might return, or worse, yet other white men who wouldn't hesitate to take advantage of three defenseless people in the middle of nowhere. She'd heard stories of what happened to women found alone on the frontier, stories that made her stomach turn even in her current desperate state. Stella finished nursing and dozed against Elena's chest, her tiny face peaceful in sleep. Looking at her daughter, Elena felt a surge of maternal ferocity that surprised her with its intensity. This child would not suffer for her father's cowardice or the brutality of this land. Whatever it took, Elena would find a way to get them to safety. "I can travel," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Give me a day to recover and we'll head for Fort Defiance." Pete shook his head slowly. "Elena, you just gave birth. You're in no condition to walk 40 miles across the desert, especially carrying a baby." "Then what do you suggest?" Elena's voice carried an edge of desperation. "That we sit here and wait to die." Before Pete could answer, a shadow fell across the entrance to their shelter. All three adults froze as a figure appeared silhouetted against the morning light, tall, lean, wearing buckskins and carrying a rifle with casual confidence. For a heart-stopping moment, Elena thought Jacob had returned, but as her eyes adjusted, she realized this was someone else entirely. The man was Native American, though not Apache, from what Elena could tell. His hair was black as midnight and hung loose to his shoulders, and his features had the sharp, aristocratic quality she'd seen in some of the Plains tribes. Most unsettling of all were his eyes, dark and intelligent, studying them with an intensity that made Elena's skin prickle. Pete slowly reached for his rifle, but the stranger shook his head and spoke in accented but clear English. "Do not. I mean no harm to you or the woman with child." Sarah pressed herself against the back wall of the shelter, her face pale with terror. Elena instinctively tightened her hold on Stella, though she forced herself to meet the stranger's gaze directly. If they were going to die, she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her cower. "What do you want?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady. The man stepped into the shelter, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness. Up close, Elena could see the intricate beadwork on his shirt and the silver ornaments in his hair. This was no ordinary warrior. The quality of his clothing and weapons spoke of high status among his people. "I have been watching," he said simply. "I saw the attack on your wagon train. I saw the men flee and leave you behind." Elena's cheeks burned with shame, though she knew the abandonment reflected badly on Jacob, not her. "If you're here to finish what the Apache started, I am not Apache," the man interrupted, a note of pride in his voice. "I am Comanche. My name is Kestrel, who hunts at dawn, though your people might find it easier to call me Kestrel." Elena had heard of the Comanche fierce horsemen who controlled vast territories across Texas and the southern plains. They were said to be the finest riders in North America, and their warrior culture was legendary. What was one of their war chiefs doing this far from Comanche territory? "Why were you watching us?" Elena asked. Kestrel moved closer, and Elena noticed he walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg. "I was scouting for my band when I heard the gunfire. I came to see what had happened." His dark eyes fixed on Stella, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I did not expect to find this." "A baby, you mean?" Elena's protective instincts flared. "A woman willing to fight for her child's life," Kestrel corrected. "Most white women would have given up by now. They would have waited for their men to rescue them, or they would have died from fear alone." Elena bristled at the implicit criticism of her race, though she had to admit there was some truth to his observation. How many frontier wives would have attempted what she was planning? "I don't have the luxury of giving up. This child depends on me." Something shifted in Kestrel's expression, a flicker of what might have been respect. "Yes, I can see that." He glanced around their meager shelter, taking in their depleted water supply and limited resources. "You cannot survive here much longer." "We know that," Pete said roughly, "but we don't have many options." Kestrel studied the old man for a moment, then returned his attention to Elena. There is another way. My people's winter camp is 3 days' ride from here. You would be safe there until spring. Sarah gasped audibly. Go with Indians, Elena. You can't be serious. But Elena was considering the offer more carefully than Sarah's horrified reaction might suggest. What did she really know about her own people's treatment of women and children? In desperate circumstances, Jacob's abandonment had shown her exactly how much protection she could expect from white men when danger threatened. At least this Comanche was being honest about his intentions. Why would you help us? She asked. What do you gain from protecting 3 white strangers? Kestrel was quiet for a long moment, and Elena sensed he was weighing how much truth to reveal. Finally, he spoke. My wife died in childbirth 2 winters ago. Our son lived only 3 days. His voice remained steady, but Elena caught the pain that flickered across his features. Perhaps the spirits have sent me this chance to save a life I could not save before. The raw honesty in his words hit Elena like a physical blow. Here was a man who understood loss, who knew what it meant to hold a dying child and be powerless to help. Whatever cultural differences lay between them, grief was a language they both spoke fluently. Even if I wanted to accept your offer, Elena said carefully, how do I know your people would welcome us? We're white. We're the enemy. Some would see it that way, Kestrel admitted, but our laws protect those who seek shelter under a warrior's protection. And, he paused, studying Stella's sleeping face, children are precious to us no matter their blood. A baby born under such circumstances might be seen as blessed by the spirits. Pete made a sound of disbelief. Elena, you can't seriously be considering this. These people are savages. They'll scalp us all as soon as we reach their camp. Kestrel's expression darkened, and his hand moved to the knife at his belt. Old man, you speak of things you do not understand. My people have laws older than your nation, codes of honor your civilized men seem to have forgotten. When did your husband last show such honor? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Elena looked down at Stella, trying to weigh their impossible options. Stay here and almost certainly die from exposure or starvation. Attempt the journey to Fort Defiance and probably collapse before they'd traveled 10 miles. Or trust this stranger who claimed to offer sanctuary among people she'd been taught to fear. If I came with you, Elena said slowly, what would be expected of me? What would happen to my daughter? You would be under my protection, Kestrel replied. No one could harm you without answering to me. As for the child, he gestured toward Stella. She would be raised as one of our own, if that became necessary. Among the Comanche, adoption is common. Blood matters less than courage. Sarah grabbed Elena's arm. Elena, please think about what you're saying. These people are heathens. They don't believe in God. They don't have civilization. How can you even consider what civilization? Elena snapped, her composure finally cracking. The civilization that taught my husband it was acceptable to abandon his pregnant wife. The civilization that leaves women and children to die while men run to save themselves. She looked directly at Kestrel. At least you're honest about what you're offering. Kestrel nodded slowly. I make no promises that life among my people would be easy for you. You would have to learn our ways, follow our customs. Some would always see you as an outsider, but you would live and your daughter would have a chance at a future. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her like a physical force. Every instinct she'd been raised with screamed against trusting a Comanche warrior, but every maternal instinct she possessed was telling her that this might be Stella's only chance at survival. When she opened her eyes, Kestrel was still watching her with that unsettling intensity. How do I know you won't just take us prisoner, use us as bargaining chips? Or worse, you don't, he said simply. You have only my word, and the word of a Comanche to a white woman may mean nothing to you. But consider this, if I wanted to harm you, what would stop me? You have no weapons, no strength to resist. I could take what I wanted and leave you here to die. The brutal honesty of his words sent a chill through Elena, but she also recognized the logic. He was right. If his intentions were malicious, he could have acted on them already. The fact that he was offering protection rather than simply taking what he wanted suggested that his motives were genuine, whatever they might be. "I need time to think," Elena said. Kestrel shook his head. "Time is a luxury you do not have. The water here will last perhaps one more day. By tomorrow night you will be too weak to travel anywhere." As if to emphasize his point, Stella began to fuss against Elena's chest, her tiny cries echoing off the rock walls. Elena tried to soothe her, but the baby's distress seemed to mirror her own internal turmoil. How could she make such a momentous decision when she could barely think straight from exhaustion and stress? "What about them?" Elena nodded toward Sarah and Pete. "Would they be welcome as well?" Kestrel studied the other two survivors with calculating eyes. "The girl, perhaps. She is young and might adapt. The old man," he shrugged, "that would depend on his willingness to show respect for our ways." Pete's face reddened with indignation. "I'll not bow and scrape to a bunch of—" "Then you will die here," Kestrel cut him off matter-of-factly. "That is your choice to make." The stark simplicity of the statement silenced Pete's protests. Elena realized that Kestrel was offering them exactly what he'd promised: a choice. Not a comfortable choice, not an easy choice, but a real alternative to slow death in the desert. "If I agree to come with you," Elena said, "I want your word that no harm will come to any of us, and I want to understand exactly what will be expected." Kestrel considered this for a moment, then nodded. "You have my word given in the presence of the spirits who watch over all children. As for expectations..." He settled into a more comfortable position, clearly prepared for a longer explanation. "You would live in my lodge until you are strong enough to care for yourself and the child. You would learn to cook our food, to make our clothes, to follow our customs. In time, if you chose to stay permanently, you might take a Comanche name and be adopted into the tribe." "And if I chose to leave," Elena asked, "when the child is old enough to travel safely, and when you are strong enough to make the journey, I would see you safely to whatever destination you chose." Kestrel's expression was solemn. "This I swear by the bones of my ancestors." Elena looked around their pathetic shelter one more time, taking in the dwindling water supply, Pete's infected wound, and Sarah's terror-stricken face. Then she looked down at Stella, who had quieted, but whose breathing seemed more labored than it should be. Her daughter needed medical attention, proper nutrition, and protection from the elements, none of which Elena could provide here. "Sarah," Elena said quietly, "I need you to decide for yourself. I won't force you to come with us, but I can't stay here any longer." Sarah's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Elena, how can you ask me to choose between dying here and living among savages?" "I'm not asking you to choose anything," Elena replied firmly. "I'm telling you what I've decided for myself and my daughter. You have to make your own choice." The young woman looked back and forth between Elena and Kestrel, her face a mask of terror and confusion. Finally she whispered, "If you're going, I can't stay here alone. I'll come with you." Pete struggled to sit up straighter, his face flushed with fever from his infected wound. "You're all making a terrible mistake. When the army finds out what happened to us, the army will assume we're dead," Elena interrupted. "Just like our husbands did. No one is coming to rescue us, Pete. We have to save ourselves." Kestrel rose smoothly to his feet. "If we are to travel, we must leave soon. The desert is dangerous even for those who know it well, and you are not strong enough for a long journey." Elena struggled to stand, her body protesting every movement. The aftermath of childbirth combined with their ordeal had left her weaker than she'd realized. When she swayed on her feet, Kestrel stepped forward and caught her arm, steadying her with surprising gentleness. "I can walk," she insisted, though they both knew it was only partially true. "Perhaps," Kestrel said diplomatically, "but there is no shame in accepting help when it is offered freely." As Elena gathered the few possessions they had left, her torn dress the makeshift swaddling clothes for Stella, and a small bundle of supplies, she found herself studying Kestrel more carefully. There was something in his manner that reminded her of the better class of men she'd known back east, a natural dignity that had nothing to do with formal education or social position. When he looked at Stella, his expression held a tenderness that seemed completely at odds with his reputation as a warrior. "Why are you really doing this?" Elena asked as she carefully wrapped Stella in the cleanest cloth they had. Kestrel was quiet for a moment, checking his weapons and scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. "I told you the truth about my wife and son, but there is more." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. 3 years ago, Comanche raiders attacked a settler family near the Brazos River. When the fighting was over, we found a white woman hiding in a root cellar with her baby daughter. The war chief wanted to kill them both. He said white children grew up to become our enemies. Elena felt her blood run cold. What happened to them? "I argued for their lives. I said the spirits had spared them for a reason, that it would bring bad medicine to kill a mother protecting her child." Kestrel's expression grew distant. "The war chief listened to my words, but in the end he chose his own path. When I returned to that place the following spring, I found their bones still lying where they had fallen." The weight of his words settled over Elena like a shroud. "You blame yourself for their deaths. I failed to convince him. I failed to save them." Kestrel looked directly at her, and Elena saw the pain that had been hidden behind his stoic facade. "Perhaps this is the spirit's way of giving me another chance to do what is right." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, not for herself or her situation, but for this man who carried the burden of strangers' deaths on his conscience. "You can't save everyone," she said softly. "No," Kestrel agreed, "but I can try to save you." The simple honesty of his statement broke through the last of Elena's resistance. Whatever dangers lay ahead in his world, they couldn't be worse than the certain death that awaited them here. And more importantly, she sensed that this man understood the fierce love that drove a parent to desperate measures. "All right," she said, cradling Stella against her chest. "We'll come with you." Kestrel nodded solemnly, as if she'd just sealed a pact that went far deeper than simple survival. "Then we leave now, while the morning is still cool. The journey will be difficult, but my horse can carry you and the child when you grow tired." As they prepared to leave their rocky shelter, Elena took one last look around the place where her daughter had been born. It wasn't much, just a few square feet of shade beside a dwindling spring, but it represented the moment when everything in her life had changed forever. She'd entered this place as Jacob Whitmore's abandoned wife. She was leaving it as something else entirely, a mother who would do whatever it took to protect her child, even if it meant stepping into a world she'd never imagined belonging to. Kestrel helped her climb onto his horse, settling her comfortably with Stella before swinging up behind them. His arms came around them both as he took the reins, and Elena was surprised by how safe she felt in his embrace. For the first time since the attack, she wasn't facing the unknown alone. As they rode away from the spring, Sarah walking beside them, and Pete grudgingly, following despite his complaints, Elena whispered a prayer for guidance. She was embarking on a journey that would either save her daughter's life or destroy them both. But as the desert stretched endlessly before them, and Kestrel's strong arms held them steady against the horse's movement, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced since Jacob's betrayal. Hope. The sun climbed higher as they traveled north, and Elena dozed fitfully against Kestrel's chest, while Stella slept in her arms. Sometimes she woke to find him speaking softly, in his own language, what sounded like prayers or songs carried away by the desert wind. Other times she caught him scanning the horizon with the alertness of a man who knew that danger could appear without warning. But gradually, as the miles passed beneath their horses' hooves, Elena began to believe that they might actually survive this journey. Against all odds, against everything she'd been taught to expect, salvation had come in the form of a Comanche warrior with gentle hands and haunted eyes. Whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges awaited them in his world, Elena was ready to face them. She had to be for Stella's sake, and for the future they would build together in this strange new life she was choosing. The desert heat shimmered around them as they rode toward an uncertain destiny, but for the first time since Jacob's abandonment, Elena wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. The Comanche winter camp emerged from the twilight like something from a fever dream, dozens of buffalo hide lodges arranged in precise circles around central fires that cast dancing shadows against the surrounding hills. Elena clutched Stella closer as they approached, her heart hammering against her ribs with a mixture of exhaustion and terror. After 3 days of hard travel across the desert, punctuated by brief rests in whatever shade they could find, the sight of so many people filled her with both relief and dread. Kestrel had spoken little during their journey, focusing his attention on navigating the treacherous terrain and watching for signs of other travelers. When he did speak, it was usually to point out landmarks or to warn them of particularly dangerous passages. But Elena had felt the tension in his body increase as they drew closer to his people's territory, and she knew he was as uncertain about their reception as she was. "Stay close to me," Kestrel murmured as they rode between the first lodges. "Do not speak unless spoken to directly, and do not make eye contact with the warriors. Among my people, such behavior from a white woman would be seen as disrespectful." Elena nodded, though the instruction grated against her independent nature. She'd spent her adult life speaking her mind and meeting people's gazes directly, and the idea of acting subservient went against every instinct she possessed. But Stella's life depended on their acceptance here, and she would swallow her pride if that's what it took to keep her daughter safe. Sarah walked beside their horse, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion and fear. The young woman had barely spoken since they'd left the spring, and Elena could see the toll their journey had taken on her. Pete brought up the rear, his wounded shoulder clearly causing him considerable pain, though he'd refused to complain during their travels. As they moved deeper into the camp, Elena became aware of the curious stares following their progress. Children stopped their games to gawk at the strange procession, while women emerged from their lodges to whisper among themselves in the flowing Comanche language. The warriors were more subtle in their observation, but Elena could feel their eyes tracking every movement, assessing the potential threat or value represented by these unexpected visitors. At the center of the camp stood a lodge larger than the others, its buffalo hide walls decorated with painted symbols that Elena didn't recognize. Kestrel guided his horse toward this structure, and Elena realized they were approaching the dwelling of someone important, perhaps the chief who would decide their fate. An elderly woman emerged from the large lodge as they approached, her long gray hair braided with silver ornaments, and her weathered face marked by the kind of wisdom that came only from surviving decades on the frontier. She studied their group with sharp black eyes before speaking rapidly to Kestrel in Comanche. Elena couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clearly one of surprise and concern. Kestrel responded in the same language, his voice respectful but firm. The conversation continued for several minutes, with other tribal members gradually gathering around to listen. Elena felt like a specimen under examination, and she had to fight the urge to demand that someone explain what was being discussed. Finally, the elderly woman approached their horse and looked up at Elena with those penetrating dark eyes. When she spoke, her English was heavily accented, but clear. "I am Singing Wolf, mother of chiefs, keeper of the old ways. Kestrel tells me you seek shelter among our people." Elena swallowed hard, acutely aware that this woman's decision could mean the difference between life and death for her family. "Yes, my husband abandoned us during an Apache attack. My daughter was born in the desert, and we have nowhere else to go." Singing Wolf's expression didn't change, but Elena caught a flicker of something that might have been sympathy. "Show me the child." With trembling hands, Elena pulled back the cloth covering Stella's face. The baby was awake, her dark eyes alert and curious as she gazed up at the circle of strange faces surrounding them. To Elena's amazement, Stella didn't cry or fuss. Instead, she seemed fascinated by these new people reaching out with tiny fingers, as if trying to touch the world around her. Singing Wolf studied the baby for a long moment, then looked back at Elena. The child has strong spirit. She will need it to survive in this world. The old woman stepped back and spoke again to Kestrel in Comanche, her tone now more thoughtful than confrontational. "What are they saying?" Sarah whispered, moving closer to Elena's side. "I don't know," Elena replied, though she was trying to read the body language of the people around them. Some seemed hostile, others merely curious, but a few, particularly, some of the women looked at Stella with expressions that Elena recognized as maternal concern. The discussion continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, Singing Wolf raised her hand for silence and addressed Elena directly. "Kestrel has invoked the ancient law of protection. He claims responsibility for your lives and your actions while you remain among us. This is not a decision made lightly. If you bring harm to our people, he will answer for it with his own life." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She'd known that Kestrel was taking a risk by helping them, but she hadn't realized the potential cost was so severe. "I would never do anything to harm him or your people," she said quickly. "We're grateful for any kindness you can show us." "Gratitude is words," Singing Wolf replied bluntly. "Actions matter more. If you stay among us, you must live by our laws, follow our customs, contribute to the welfare of the tribe. Can you do this?" Elena looked down at Stella, then back at the weathered face of this woman who held their fate in her hands. "I can learn. I will learn." Singing Wolf nodded slowly. "Then you may stay at least until the child is strong enough to travel. But understand this, you are here on Kestrel's protection, not as our guests. You must earn your place through service and respect." Relief flooded through Elena so powerfully that she nearly fell from the horse. They would live. Stella would have shelter, food, protection from the elements. Whatever challenges lay ahead, her daughter would survive. Kestrel dismounted and helped Elena down from the horse, his hands gentle as he steadied her against his chest. For a moment she allowed herself to lean into his strength, overwhelmed by exhaustion and the emotional toll of their journey. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up into his dark eyes. "I know what this cost you. The cost will be worth it if your daughter grows strong," he replied quietly. Then louder he addressed Singing Wolf. "Where should they lodge?" The elderly woman considered this question for a moment. "The white woman and her child will stay in your lodge, since you have claimed responsibility for them. The others—" She looked at Sarah and Pete with calculating eyes. "The young woman may share quarters with the unmarried girls if she can learn proper behavior. The old man will stay with the other captives until we decide what to do with him." Elena started to protest the separation, but Kestrel caught her arm. "Do not argue," he murmured. "This is generous treatment under the circumstances." As the crowd began to disperse, Elena found herself following Kestrel toward a modest lodge on the outer edge of the camp. The structure was smaller than Singing Wolf's dwelling, but larger than most of the others, its buffalo hide walls decorated with paintings of horses and hunting scenes. Smoke drifted from the opening at the top, suggesting a fire burned within. "This is your home?" Elena asked as they approached the entrance. "It was the home I shared with my wife," Kestrel replied, his voice carefully neutral. "It has been empty since her death." Elena hesitated at the entrance flap, suddenly aware of the complexity of her situation. She was about to enter the private space of a man she barely knew, in a culture she didn't understand, with customs that might consider such an arrangement scandalous or worse. "What will people think," she asked, "about me staying here with you?" Kestrel's expression was unreadable. "They will think what they choose to think. But you are under my protection, and this is the safest place for you and the child. My reputation will shield you from most gossip." Elena looked down at Stella, who had begun to fuss with hunger. Her daughter's needs had to come before her own concerns about propriety. With a deep breath, she followed Kestrel through the entrance flap. The interior of the lodge was dimly lit by a central fire, its smoke rising through the opening above. Buffalo robes covered the floor, and various possessions hung from the wooden framework: weapons, tools, clothing, and what appeared to be personal mementos. The space felt lived in, but somehow hollow, as if the life had gone out of it, along with its former occupant. "You can sleep there," Kestrel said, indicating a pile of soft robes near the fire. "It will be warm for the child." Elena sank down onto the indicated spot, her legs finally giving out after the ordeal of their journey. Stella was crying now, her tiny voice sharp with hunger and discomfort. Elena began to unbutton her dress to nurse, then stopped, suddenly aware of Kestrel's presence. He seemed to understand her dilemma immediately. "I will give you privacy," he said, moving toward the entrance. "There are things I must discuss with the council anyway." After he left, Elena fed Stella and tried to process everything that had happened. 3 days ago, she'd been a white settler's wife traveling to California. Now she was living in a Comanche lodge, dependent on the protection of a warrior whose own people viewed her with suspicion. The transformation felt surreal, like something from a wild adventure novel, rather than her actual life. When Stella finished nursing, Elena explored their new surroundings more thoroughly. The lodge was surprisingly comfortable, with everything arranged for maximum efficiency. Cooking utensils hung near the fire, weapons were stored within easy reach, and clothing was organized in decorated parfleche containers. Everything spoke of a people who had learned to live in harmony with their harsh environment. As evening deepened, other women from the tribe began to arrive at the lodge. They came singly or in pairs, ostensibly to deliver food, blankets, or other necessities, but Elena could tell they were really there to satisfy their curiosity about the white woman and her baby. Most spoke little or no English, but they communicated through gestures and expressions, examining Stella with the universal interest that women showed in newborns. One young woman, perhaps 18 years old, lingered longer than the others. She had an intelligent face and kind eyes, and when she spoke, her English was much better than the rest. "I am Bluebird," she said, settling cross-legged beside Elena. "Kestrel is my brother." Elena felt a surge of relief at finding someone she could actually communicate with. "I'm Elena, and this is Stella. Your brother saved our lives." Bluebird nodded gravely. "He told me what happened to your people. It is good that you survived, but it will not be easy for you here. Many do not trust white settlers, and some will see your presence as an insult." "What should I do?" Elena asked. "How can I show that I mean no harm?" "Learn our ways quickly," Bluebird advised. "Show respect for our customs, contribute to the work of the tribe, and prove that you can be useful. My brother has powerful enemies among the war chiefs. They will look for any excuse to challenge his decision to protect you." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What kind of enemies?" "There is a warrior named Iron Hawk who believes all white people should be killed or driven from our lands. He has many followers among the younger men, and he sees Kestrel's protection of you as weakness." Bluebird's expression was troubled. "Iron Hawk has been challenging my brother's authority for moons. Your presence gives him new ammunition." Before Elena could respond, the entrance flap opened and Kestrel returned. His face was grim, and Elena could tell that whatever discussions he'd had with the tribal council hadn't gone well. "What did they say?" Bluebird asked in English, apparently for Elena's benefit. "The council is divided," Kestrel replied, settling beside the fire. "Singing Wolf and the older women support giving sanctuary, but some of the war chiefs want the whites sent away or killed." Elena's heart sank. "Iron Hawk," Kestrel's eyes sharpened. "Bluebird has been talking." "She needed to know," his sister replied defensively. If she's going to survive here, she must understand the dangers. Kestrel studied Elena's face in the firelight. Iron Hawk has demanded a council meeting tomorrow. He wants to challenge my right to offer protection without tribal consent. What happens if he wins the challenge? Elena asked, though she dreaded the answer. Then you and your companions will be handed over to him, Kestrel said bluntly, and Iron Hawk believes the only good white settler is a dead one. Elena clutched Stella closer, feeling the fragile security of the day crumbling around her. Is there anything we can do? Any way to convince the council that we're not a threat? Perhaps, Kestrel said thoughtfully, but it would require you to do something that might go against everything you believe. What do you mean? Kestrel exchanged a look with his sister before answering. Tomorrow's council will not just be about your fate, it will be about mine as well. Iron Hawk has been waiting for an opportunity to challenge my leadership among the war chiefs. If he can prove that I make decisions based on weakness rather than wisdom, he can undermine my influence permanently. Elena was beginning to understand the true complexity of their situation. This wasn't just about sanctuary for her family, it was about tribal politics and power struggles that had been brewing long before she arrived. Tell me what you need me to do, she said firmly. The council will want to see that you're willing to embrace our ways completely, not just live among us temporarily, Kestrel explained. If you were to undergo the naming ceremony to officially become Comanche, it would show that your presence here is permanent, not just a burden we're carrying. Elena felt her world tilt. You're asking me to give up my identity entirely. I'm asking you to save your daughter's life, Kestrel replied quietly. The ceremony would give you a place in the tribe protection under our laws. You would become my sister, entitled to all the rights and protections that relationship brings. The weight of the decision pressed down on Elena like a physical force. Becoming Comanche would mean abandoning not just her past, but any hope of returning to white society. She would be cutting herself off from everything she'd known, everything she'd been raised to believe about herself and her place in the world. But as she looked down at Stella's peaceful face, Elena knew she didn't really have a choice. Her daughter's life was worth any sacrifice, any transformation. How long do I have to decide? She asked. The council meets at sunrise, Bluebird said softly. The ceremony, if you choose it, would happen immediately afterward. Elena nodded, her mind already racing through the implications. By tomorrow evening, she would either be dead or reborn as someone completely different. There was no middle ground, no compromise that would satisfy both worlds. As the night deepened and the lodge grew quiet, except for the crackling of the fire, Elena held Stella close and whispered stories about the life they might have had. Stories about a white house with a picket fence, about Sunday services, and school lessons about growing up safe and sheltered from the harsh realities of the frontier. But even as she told these stories, Elena knew they were fairy tales now. The life she'd planned for her daughter had died in the desert, along with her marriage and her faith in the civilization she'd left behind. Tomorrow would bring either death or transformation, and Elena found herself hoping for the courage to choose correctly when the moment came. Outside the lodge, she could hear the sounds of the camp settling into sleep. Children's laughter giving way to adult conversations around the fires, the soft nickering of horses, the distant howl of coyotes calling across the plains. It was a different world from anything she'd known, but as she drifted toward sleep with Stella warm against her chest, Elena realized it didn't feel entirely foreign anymore. Perhaps that was the most dangerous change of all. Dawn came like a blade of fire across the eastern horizon, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness with merciless clarity. Elena had barely slept, her mind churning with the weight of the decision that awaited her. Stella had been restless too, as if sensing her mother's anxiety, and Elena had spent much of the night pacing the confines of the lodge while trying to calm both her daughter and her own racing thoughts. The sounds of the camp stirring to life filtered through the buffalo hide walls. The low murmur of voices, the crackling of fires being rekindled, the soft footsteps of people beginning their daily routines. But today was different. Elena could feel the tension in the air, the electric anticipation that preceded moments when everything could change forever. Kestrel had risen before first light and left the lodge without speaking, his face grave with the knowledge of what the day would bring. Elena understood that he was preparing for his own trial as much as hers, that Ironhawk's challenge would test not just her right to sanctuary, but Kestrel's position among his people. Bluebird arrived as the sun crested the hills, carrying a bundle of clothing and a bowl of some kind of grain porridge. Her young face was tight with worry, and Elena could see that she'd been crying. "The council fires are already burning," Bluebird said without preamble. "Ironhawk has been speaking to the warriors since before dawn, poisoning their minds against you and my brother." Elena accepted the bowl gratefully, though her stomach churned too much for her to eat more than a few spoonfuls. "What is he telling them? That white settlers are a disease that spreads wherever they go, that showing mercy to your people only encourages more to come, bringing soldiers and sickness and the destruction of our hunting grounds." Bluebird's voice was bitter. "He speaks of the treaties that were broken, the promises that were lies, the children who died from white man's diseases." Elena felt the familiar weight of collective guilt settling on her shoulders. She couldn't argue with Ironhawk's accusations because too many of them were true. White expansion had brought tremendous suffering to the native peoples, and her own presence here was proof of that ongoing conflict. "What about the clothing?" Elena asked, nodding toward the bundle Bluebird had brought. "If you choose the naming ceremony, you cannot appear before the tribe in white woman's clothing," Bluebird explained, unfolding a beautiful dress made of soft deerskin and decorated with intricate beadwork. "This belonged to Kestrel's wife. She was approximately your size." Elena stared at the dress, recognizing the profound symbolism of what Bluebird was offering. To wear a dead woman's clothes, especially for such a ceremony, would be seen as either the ultimate honor or the ultimate sacrilege, depending on one's perspective. "Are you certain this is appropriate?" Elena asked. "I don't want to dishonor her memory." Bluebird's expression softened. "Moon dancing was my friend, as well as my brother's wife. She would have wanted her clothes to serve life rather than gathering dust in storage. And," she hesitated, "she would have understood what it means to fight for your child's survival." Elena accepted the dress with trembling hands, feeling the weight of history and expectation in the soft leather. As she changed clothes, carefully working around Stella, who was nursing at her breast, she felt herself transforming in ways that went beyond mere appearance. The white cotton dress that had marked her as a settler's wife was replaced by garments that spoke of a completely different way of life, one built around survival, adaptation, and harmony with the harsh beauty of the plains. When she emerged from the lodge carrying Stella, Elena found that a crowd had already gathered around the council fire. Warriors sat in concentric circles according to their status and clan affiliations, while women and children watched from the periphery. The atmosphere was charged with tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. Kestrel stood near the fire, his posture erect and proud, despite the challenges he faced. Across from him, Ironhawk commanded his own circle of supporters, younger warriors whose faces were painted for war and whose eyes burned with righteous anger. Between them sat the tribal elders, including Singing Wolf, who would ultimately decide the fate of everyone involved. Elena took her place among the women, acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed her movement. Some looks were curious, others hostile, but a few held what might have been sympathy. She recognized the universal bond of motherhood in the eyes of women who understood what it meant to fight for a child's survival. Singing Wolf rose from her place among the elders, her aged voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "We are here to decide the fate of the white woman and her child, and to address Ironhawk's challenge to Kestrel's authority in offering protection without tribal consent." Ironhawk stood immediately, his tall frame impressive in the morning light. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the lean build of a lifelong warrior and the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding respect. When he spoke, his voice carried the power of absolute conviction. "My people, we face a moment that will define our future for generations to come. For too long we have watched as white settlers pour across our lands like locusts, consuming everything in their path. They bring soldiers, diseases, and the destruction of the buffalo herds that sustain us. And now one of our own war chiefs asks us to shelter these destroyers in our very midst." A murmur of agreement rippled through his supporters. Elena felt Stella stir against her chest and adjusted the baby's position, trying to keep her calm despite the charged atmosphere. "I do not speak from hatred alone." Ironhawk continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd. "I speak from the wisdom of experience. Every time we have shown mercy to white people, they have repaid that mercy with betrayal. They take our kindness as weakness, our generosity as an invitation to take more." Several warriors nodded at these words, and Elena could see the power of Ironhawk's rhetoric working on the crowd. He was speaking to their deepest fears and angers, tapping into years of justified resentment against white encroachment. "But this is not just about the white woman," Ironhawk said, his tone growing harder. "This is about the authority to make decisions that affect the entire tribe." Kestrel acted without consulting the council, without considering the consequences of his choice. What happens when other whites come looking for this woman? What happens when soldiers follow her trail to our winter camp? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Elena hadn't considered this possibility, but now it seemed glaringly obvious. If Jacob or the other survivors from the wagon train had made it to civilization, there might indeed be search parties looking for her. Her presence here could endanger every member of the tribe. Kestrel rose to respond, his voice calm but firm. "Ironhawk speaks of wisdom, but wisdom requires looking beyond immediate anger to see the larger pattern. Yes, white settlers have brought suffering to our people, but not all whites are the same, just as not all Comanche are the same." He gestured toward Elena, and she felt every eye in the gathering turn toward her. This woman was abandoned by her own people, left to die in the desert while carrying a child. She has seen the same betrayal and cowardice that we have experienced from white men. Perhaps the spirits brought her to us not as an enemy, but as someone who could understand our struggles. Ironhawk's expression hardened. "Pretty words, but words do not change the fundamental nature of white people. She may seem grateful now, but what happens when she recovers her strength? What happens when she remembers the comfort of white civilization and decides our way of life is too harsh? Then she will be free to leave," Kestrel replied simply. "I have not taken her as a captive. I offer protection to someone who needs it, just as our ancestors offered protection to any who sought shelter under our lodges. Our ancestors also had the wisdom to know their enemies," Ironhawk shot back. "They did not invite wolves into their teepees simply because the wolves claimed to be hungry." The debate continued for nearly an hour, with various tribal members speaking for or against Elena's presence. Some shared Ironhawk's suspicions, while others supported Kestrel's decision based on traditional laws of hospitality. Through it all, Elena sat in silence, understanding that her fate was being decided by forces far larger than her individual circumstances. Finally, Singing Wolf called for quiet. "We have heard many words, but words alone do not resolve such matters. Ironhawk, you have challenged not just Kestrel's decision, but his right to make such decisions. Do you wish to formalize this challenge?" Elena felt her blood turn to ice as she realized what was being discussed. Among warrior cultures, formal challenges often meant combat, potentially to the death. The thought that Kestrel might have to fight for his life because of her presence was almost unbearable. Ironhawk's smile was cold and predatory. "I do. Let Kestrel prove in combat that his decision was wise, that his protection of these whites serves the interests of our people. And if I win, Kestrel asked quietly, then the woman and her child may stay, and I will speak no more against your decision, Ironhawk replied. But if I win, they will be handed over to me to face the justice that all white invaders deserve. Elena couldn't remain silent any longer. Rising to her feet with Stella in her arms, she stepped forward into the circle of firelight. The entire gathering turned to stare at her, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. I will not let men die because of me, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. If my presence here causes such division among your people, then perhaps it would be better if I left. Singing Wolf studied her with those sharp black eyes. You would abandon the protection that Kestrel offers. You would take your newborn child back into the desert to die. Elena looked down at Stella, who was gazing up at her with those alert, dark eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond her days. I would rather die free than live, knowing that good men fought because of my presence. Even if it means your child dies as well. Ironhawk asked, his voice holding a note of what might have been respect. Elena met his gaze, directly drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. My daughter will know that her mother faced her enemies with honor, that she did not hide behind the protection of others when the cost became too high. A murmur ran through the crowd at her words, and Elena could see that she had surprised many of them. They had expected her to cling to safety regardless of the cost, to act with the selfishness they associated with white settlers. But there is another way. Elena continued, her voice growing stronger. Bluebird told me about the naming ceremony, about becoming truly Comanche rather than just a guest among your people. If that would resolve the division, if it would prove my commitment to your ways, then I choose that path. Ironhawk's expression shifted to one of skeptical interest. You would give up your white identity entirely, accept our customs, our gods, our way of life, even knowing that it would mean you could never return to your own people. What people? Elena asked bitterly. The husband who abandoned me to die, the men who fled rather than protect women and children. If those are my people, then I renounce them gladly. Singing Wolf leaned forward, her aged face intent. The naming ceremony is not just words, white woman. It is a sacred transformation that cannot be undone. You would become Comanche in spirit, as well as name, bound by our laws and our obligations. Are you prepared for such a change? Elena thought of Jacob's betrayal of the wagon train survivors, who had fled without looking back, of the civilization that had failed to protect its most vulnerable members. Then she looked around at the people who had taken her in, despite their legitimate fears and suspicions, who had offered shelter when her own people had offered only abandonment. I am, she said firmly. If you will have me, I choose to become Comanche. Ironhawk studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. If he accepted her offer to undergo the naming ceremony, he would lose much of his justification for challenging Kestrel's authority. But if he refused, he would appear to be motivated more by personal ambition than by genuine concern for tribal welfare. And what of your companions? He asked. The young woman and the old man who came with you. Elena felt a pang of guilt at not having considered Sarah and Pete in her decision. That should be their choice to make. I cannot speak for them. Singing Wolf gestured, and Sarah was brought forward from where she had been standing with the other captives. The young woman looked terrified but determined, her pale face set in lines of resolve that reminded Elena of her own mother. Sarah Morrison, Singing Wolf said formally, do you also choose to undergo the naming ceremony and become Comanche, or do you prefer to take your chances in the desert? Sarah looked back and forth between Elena and the gathered tribal members, clearly struggling with the enormity of the decision. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. I want to live. If becoming Comanche means survival, then yes, I choose the ceremony. Old Pete Fletcher was brought forward next, his infected shoulder clearly causing him considerable pain. When offered the same choice, his response was immediate and predictable. "I'll not bow down to a bunch of heathen savages," he declared, his voice strong despite his physical weakness. "I'd rather die as a Christian than live as a godless Indian." Elena felt a mixture of admiration and frustration at his stubbornness. She understood his position. He was too old and too set in his ways to adapt to such a radical change. But his refusal also complicated her own situation. Ironhawk smiled at Pete's response. "Then we have a problem. 2 of the whites choose to become Comanche while 1 refuses. What do we do with him?" "That is for the council to decide," Singing Wolf said diplomatically. "But first, we must complete the naming ceremonies for those who have chosen that path." What followed was unlike anything Elena had ever experienced. The ceremony began with purification rituals, involving smoke from burning sage and sweetgrass, the aromatic clouds washing over her and Stella, as tribal members chanted in the flowing Comanche language. Elena found herself oddly moved by the solemnity of the proceedings, by the sense that she was participating in something ancient and sacred. Singing Wolf approached her carrying a bowl of paint made from red clay and animal fat. "Your white name must die so that your Comanche name can be born. From this moment forward, you are no longer Elena Whitmore. You are Aiyana, Eternal Blossom, so named because you bloomed in the desert where others would have withered." The old woman began painting symbols on Elena's face and hands, each mark carrying specific meaning within Comanche tradition. As the paint dried on her skin, Elena felt something fundamental shifting inside her, as if she really was being transformed into someone new. "And the child?" Singing Wolf asked, looking down at Stella. Elena realized she had to speak for her daughter to choose a name that would define Stella's place in this new world. "She was born under the stars in the desert when I thought we would both die. I would call her Sitlali Star if that is acceptable." Singing Wolf nodded approvingly. "Sitlali it is. She will be raised as Comanche taught our ways from birth. She will know no other life." The ceremony continued with the marking of Sarah, who received the name Aiyana's sister Mourning Dove, in recognition of her choice to stay with Elena despite her fears. Throughout the proceedings, Elena was acutely aware of Ironhawk, watching everything with calculating eyes, clearly still weighing his options. When the naming ceremony was complete, Singing Wolf addressed the assembled crowd. "These women are now Comanche. They are under the protection of our laws and bound by our customs. Ironhawk, do you still wish to challenge Kestrel's authority now that the circumstances have changed?" Ironhawk was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving between Elena and Kestrel. Finally, he spoke. "The naming ceremony resolves some of my concerns, but not all. These women may call themselves Comanche now, but they have not proven their loyalty. Words and paint do not change a lifetime of white thinking." Elena felt her temper flare at his continued suspicion, but before she could respond, Kestrel stepped forward. "Then let them prove themselves through actions rather than words," he said. "Give them the chance to contribute to tribal life, to show their commitment through service. If they fail to adapt or prove untrustworthy, then your concerns will be justified." "And what of the old man who refuses the ceremony?" Ironhawk pressed. "Do we simply release him to bring soldiers down upon us?" This question hung in the air like a death sentence. Elena could see the logic of Ironhawk's concern. Pete knew the location of the winter camp and could potentially lead authorities to them, but the thought of the old man being killed because of her presence was unbearable. "I offer an alternative," Elena said suddenly, the words coming to her as she spoke. "Let me take him to the nearest white settlement myself. I know the way we traveled to get here, and I can ensure he reaches safety without revealing the location of your camp." Iron Hawk's eyebrows rose in surprise. You would leave your newborn child to escort this stubborn fool to safety. I would take Sitlali with me, Elena replied, using her daughter's new name deliberately. It would only be for a few days, and it would remove any threat he might pose to your people. Kestrel looked alarmed. Aiyana, such a journey would be dangerous for you and the child. You have not yet recovered from giving birth, and winter weather can change quickly on the plains. But Elena could see the wisdom in her own proposal. It would demonstrate her loyalty to her new people while solving the problem of Pete's presence. More importantly, it would show Iron Hawk and his supporters that she was willing to risk her own safety for the welfare of the tribe. I am Comanche now, she said firmly. I will do what is necessary to protect my people. The phrase, my people, seemed to resonate through the gathering. Elena could see expressions changing hostility, giving way to curiosity and perhaps even respect. She had thrown in her lot completely with the tribe, claiming them as family rather than treating them as temporary protectors. Singing Wolf studied Elena's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. The proposal has merit, but you will not travel alone. That would be foolish and dangerous. Kestrel will accompany you, and you will take additional warriors for protection. Iron Hawk's expression suggested he still wasn't entirely satisfied, but he could hardly object to a plan that removed the immediate security threat while testing Elena's commitment to her new identity. Very well, he said grudgingly, but understand this: if you fail to return, if you use this journey as an opportunity to escape back to white society, there will be consequences for those you leave behind. Elena met his gaze steadily. I understand. But I will return because this is my home now. As the council disbanded and the crowd began to disperse, Elena felt the weight of what she had committed herself to. In the space of a few hours, she had given up her identity as a white woman, accepted responsibility for Pete's safety, and pledged her loyalty to a people she barely understood. The enormity of the changes was almost overwhelming. Kestrel approached her as she stood by the dying council fire, his expression unreadable. You realize what you have done, he asked quietly. I've chosen survival, Elena replied, for myself and for Sitlali. You have chosen much more than that, Kestrel said. You have bound yourself to a way of life that will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine. Are you truly prepared for what lies ahead? Elena looked down at Stella Sitlali, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms, seemingly unbothered by the dramatic changes in their circumstances. Her daughter would grow up. Comanche would learn to ride horses and speak a different language and follow customs that were still foreign to Elena herself. I don't know, Elena admitted, but I know I'm prepared to try, and I know that whatever challenges we face, they can't be worse than what we've already survived. Kestrel nodded, and for the first time since she'd met him, Elena saw something that might have been approval in his dark eyes. Then we will prepare for the journey to deliver your friend to safety. And when we return, your real education in Comanche life will begin. As they walked back toward Kestrel's lodge, now her lodge as well, Elena realized that she had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. She was no longer Elena Whitmore, abandoned wife of a coward. She was Aiyana, eternal blossom Comanche woman and mother of Sitlali. The transformation felt both terrifying and liberating, like stepping off the edge of a cliff and discovering she could fly. The journey to Fort Defiance began 3 days later, under a sky that threatened snow, the kind of heavy gray clouds that spoke of winter's imminent arrival on the high plains. Elena Aiyana, now she reminded herself constantly, rode beside Kestrel with Sitlali strapped securely against her chest in a traditional Comanche cradleboard that Bluebird had hastily constructed. Behind them, Pete Fletcher sat hunched on a borrowed horse, his infected shoulder clearly causing him considerable pain despite the poultices the tribal medicine woman had applied. 2 young warriors, Swift Arrow and Painted Wolf, completed their small party. Both men had volunteered for the mission despite Ironhawk's obvious displeasure at their participation. Elena suspected their motivation had more to do with curiosity about her commitment than genuine enthusiasm for escorting a stubborn white man to safety, but she was grateful for their protection nonetheless. The landscape they traveled through was harsh and beautiful in equal measure, rolling hills covered with short grass that had turned golden brown with the approaching winter, broken by deep arroyos and rocky outcroppings that provided both shelter and potential ambush points. Elena found herself studying the terrain with new eyes, trying to understand how her adopted people read the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death in this unforgiving environment. "You're learning to see," Kestrel observed as they paused to rest the horses beside a small creek. "Most white people look at this land and see only emptiness. They don't understand that it speaks to those who know how to listen." Elena shifted Citlali to her other arm, marveling at how quickly her daughter had adapted to the constant motion of travel. The baby seemed to thrive on the rhythmic movement of horseback riding, often falling asleep within minutes of beginning their daily journey. "What is it telling you now?" Elena asked, genuinely curious about this new way of perceiving the world around her. Kestrel pointed to a distant ridge where a small herd of antelope grazed peacefully. "That we are not being followed, at least not closely. The antelope would be nervous if other riders had passed this way recently." He gestured toward the sky. "The clouds say snow will come tonight, but not heavily. We will reach the fort tomorrow before the weather becomes dangerous." Pete Fletcher snorted from where he sat, slumped against a boulder. "Bunch of superstitious nonsense. Animals don't predict the weather, and clouds are just clouds." Swift Arrow and Painted Wolf exchanged glances, clearly understanding enough English to follow the conversation. Elena could see the contempt in their eyes for Pete's dismissive attitude, and she realized that the old man's stubborn refusal to show any respect for Comanche ways was making their mission more dangerous than it needed to be. "Pete," she said carefully, "these men are risking their lives to ensure your safety. The least you could do is show some gratitude for their knowledge and skills." "Gratitude," Pete's voice rose with indignation, "for being dragged across the wilderness by a bunch of heathens. I never asked for their help, and I sure as hell don't need lectures about appreciating savage wisdom." Elena felt her temper flare, but before she could respond, Kestrel placed a restraining hand on her arm. "Do not waste your energy arguing with him," he said quietly. "Some people choose to remain blind even when their blindness leads to death." As they resumed their journey, Elena found herself thinking about the profound changes that had occurred in her understanding of the world. A month ago, she would have shared many of Pete's prejudices, would have dismissed native knowledge as primitive superstition. Now she was learning to see the incredible sophistication hidden behind what white society labeled as savagery. The Comanche understanding of the natural world was far more complex and nuanced than anything she'd encountered in her previous life. They read the landscape like a book written in a language that took years to master, interpreting subtle signs that revealed everything from weather patterns to the movement of game animals to the presence of enemies. Their survival depended on this knowledge, and they had refined it over generations of life on the plains. That evening they made camp in a sheltered grove of cottonwoods beside another creek. Kestrel and the two warriors moved with practiced efficiency, selecting the site for maximum protection from wind and potential threats while ensuring access to water and grazing for the horses. Elena watched their preparations with growing appreciation for the careful thought that went into every decision. As Kestrel had predicted, snow began falling after dark. Not the blizzard that could kill travelers caught in the open, but a steady dusting that turned the world silver under the moonlight. Elena sat beside the small fire nursing Citlali, while Pete huddled in his blankets nearby, alternately complaining about the cold and muttering prayers under his breath. "Why did you really agree to escort him to safety?" Kestrel asked quietly, settling beside Elena with his own share of the dried meat and pemmican that constituted their trail rations. Elena considered the question carefully. The honest answer was more complex than she'd admitted to herself at the time. Partly because I knew Iron Hawk was right to see him as a threat. If soldiers come looking for him and find your winter camp. She shuddered at the thought of what military retaliation might mean for the people who had given her sanctuary. And the other part, Kestrel pressed. Elena looked across the fire at Pete's hunched form. Despite his bigotry and stubbornness, she couldn't help feeling responsible for his situation. He'd survived the Apache attack only to find himself a prisoner among people he'd been taught to fear and hate. In some ways, his refusal to adapt was more understandable than her own willingness to embrace such radical change. "He's a link to who I used to be," she admitted, "and maybe I needed to prove to myself that I could let that person go completely." Kestrel studied her face in the firelight. "Do you regret the choice you made?" Elena looked down at Kitlali, who was sleeping peacefully despite the cold wind and falling snow. Her daughter would never know the comfortable civilization Elena had been raised in, but she would also never experience the kind of betrayal that had shattered Elena's faith in that world. "Ask me again in a year," Elena said, "when I've learned enough of your ways to understand what I've truly chosen." Swift Arrow spoke up from where he was checking the horses. His English was limited, but he managed to convey his thoughts clearly enough. "White woman fight for baby like Comanche mother. This good thing." The simple acceptance in Hampira's words meant more to Elena than elaborate speeches might have. These young warriors had seen her willingness to risk everything for her child's welfare, and they recognized something universal in that maternal, fierce protectiveness that transcended racial and cultural boundaries. The next morning brought clear skies and bitter cold, the kind of crystalline winter day that made every breath visible and turned exposed skin numb within minutes. They broke camp before dawn and pushed hard toward Fort Defiance, knowing that winter weather on the plains could change from merely uncomfortable to deadly with little warning. Fort Defiance appeared on the horizon just after midday, a collection of wooden buildings surrounded by a crude stockade that looked both formidable and vulnerable, depending on one's perspective. Elena had never seen a military outpost before, and she was struck by how small and isolated it appeared against the vast emptiness of the surrounding landscape. "This is where we part company," Kestrel said as they paused on a ridge overlooking the fort. "You and Pete will ride down alone. We will wait here until you return." Elena felt a sudden surge of panic at the thought of entering the white world again, even temporarily. What if the soldiers refused to let her leave? What if they decided she'd been taken captive and needed to be rescued from her Comanche family? The irony of fearing salvation from her own people was not lost on her. "What if they won't let me go?" she asked. "Then we will come for you," Swift Arrow said matter-of-factly, his hand resting on his rifle. "You are Comanche now. We do not abandon our people." The fierce loyalty in his voice reminded Elena of everything she'd gained by choosing this new life. Whatever happened at the fort, she was no longer alone in the world. She had people who would fight for her, who considered her family despite the accident of her birth. The ride down to the fort gates took only a few minutes, but it felt like crossing between two different worlds. As they approached the wooden stockade, Elena could see soldiers moving on the walls, their blue uniforms a stark reminder of the military power that threatened her adopted people's way of life. The gates opened at their approach, and a sergeant stepped forward to greet them. His face was weathered by years of frontier service, and his eyes held the perpetual wariness of a man who had learned not to trust appearances. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Mackenzie. Are you all right? Have you been harmed?" Elena realized how she must appear to him, a white woman dressed in Comanche clothing carrying an infant accompanying an obviously injured man. The assumption that she was a rescued captive was natural enough from his perspective. "I'm fine, Sergeant," Elena replied carefully. "This is Pete Fletcher. He was wounded in an Apache attack on our wagon train and needs medical attention. I was able to bring him here safely." Mackenzie's eyes narrowed as he took in the details of her appearance more carefully. "You said you brought him here safely, ma'am. Might I ask how you managed that considering the circumstances?" Elena felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. How she answered this question could determine whether she was allowed to return to her new family or held against her will for her own protection. "I received help from friendly natives," she said, choosing her words carefully. "They provided escort to ensure Mr. Fletcher reached medical care." "And where are these friendly natives now?" Mackenzie asked, his tone suggesting he found the entire story highly suspicious. "They preferred not to approach the fort directly," Elena replied. "I'm sure you can understand their caution given the current tensions in the region." Mackenzie studied her for a long moment, clearly trying to decide whether she was telling the truth or had been coached in what to say. Finally, he gestured for them to enter the fort. "Let's get Mr. Fletcher to the post surgeon, and then we'll need to discuss your situation in more detail, ma'am." As they passed through the gates, Elena felt like she was entering a different world, one that suddenly seemed cramped and artificial after the open spaces of the plains. The fort was a hive of activity, with soldiers going about their duties and civilians conducting various forms of business. But after her time with the Comanche, the rigid structure and formal hierarchies felt alien and confining. The post surgeon, a harried-looking man named Dr. Patterson, examined Pete's infected shoulder with professional competence while Elena waited outside the medical tent. Through the canvas walls, she could hear Pete's voice rising in agitation as he began telling his version of their story. "Sergeant, that woman in there has been living with a band of Comanche for weeks." Pete's voice carried clearly in the cold air. "She's gone native, turned her back on Christian civilization. Someone needs to make her see sense before it's too late." Elena felt her heart sink as she realized Pete was going to make her return to the tribe as difficult as possible. She shouldn't have been surprised. His reaction was entirely consistent with everything he'd said and done since their rescue, but she'd hoped he might show some discretion for the sake of the people who had saved his life. Sergeant Mackenzie emerged from the medical tent with a grim expression. "Mrs. Just Aiyana will be fine," Elena said deliberately, using her Comanche name. Mackenzie's eyebrows rose. "Ma'am, I think we need to have a serious conversation about your situation. Mr. Fletcher has made some very disturbing allegations about your associations with hostile Indians." Elena lifted her chin defiantly. "Mr. Fletcher is entitled to his opinions, Sergeant, but I'm a free woman and I have the right to make my own choices about where and how I live. Not if those choices endanger other settlers or interfere with military operations," Mackenzie replied firmly. "If you've been living with Comanche raiders, you may have information that could prevent future attacks." Elena felt the trap closing around her. The sergeant wasn't interested in her welfare. He was interested in using her as a source of intelligence about Comanche movements and plans. If she refused to cooperate, he might decide to hold her indefinitely for questioning. "I've seen no evidence of planned raids," Elena said carefully. "The people who helped me were focused on surviving the winter, not conducting military operations. Even so, I'm going to have to insist that you remain here until we can arrange for your transportation to a proper settlement," Mackenzie said. "A white woman traveling alone with an infant in this country is asking for trouble." Elena felt panic rising in her chest. "Sergeant, I appreciate your concern, but I have commitments that require my return. People are expecting me." "What people?" Mackenzie's voice sharpened. "The Comanche who have been harboring you." Before Elena could answer, the sound of gunfire erupted from the direction of the fort's main gate. Soldiers began running toward the walls, and Elena heard shouts about riders approaching fast. Her heart leaped with hope that Kestrel and the others had come for her, but it sank again when she realized that any rescue attempt would likely result in bloodshed. Through the chaos, she heard a soldier calling out from the wall. "Sergeant, there's a white man approaching under a flag of truce. Says he's looking for his wife." Elena felt the blood drain from her face as the horrible realization hit her. Jacob. Somehow, against all odds and expectations, her cowardly husband had found her. The man who had abandoned her to die in the desert had come to claim her just when she'd finally found a new life. Sergeant Mackenzie noticed her reaction immediately. "You know who that might be, ma'am." Elena clutched Citlali closer to her chest, her mind racing through the implications. If Jacob was here, it meant he'd survived the Apache attack and made it to some form of civilization. It also meant that he'd likely told authorities about the attack, possibly leading to military action against the tribes in the area. Most importantly, it meant her carefully constructed new identity was about to be challenged by someone who knew exactly who she used to be. "It might be my former husband," she admitted reluctantly. "Jacob Whitmore." Mackenzie's expression grew more interested. "Former husband, ma'am, I'm beginning to think there's a lot more to your story than you've been telling us." Before Elena could respond, the fort gates opened, and a familiar figure rode through Jacob Whitmore, looking older and more weathered than she remembered, but unmistakably the man who had promised to love and protect her until death do them part. The man who had abandoned that promise the moment it required actual courage. Their eyes met across the crowded courtyard, and Elena saw a complex mixture of emotions cross Jacob's face. Relief, guilt, hope, and something that might have been genuine regret. But whatever feelings he harbored, Elena felt only a cold emptiness where love used to live. "Elena," Jacob called out, dismounting from his horse and striding toward her. "Thank God you're alive. I've been searching for weeks, following every lead, praying that somehow you'd survived." Elena stepped back instinctively as he approached her, every instinct rebelling against his presence. "Have you indeed, Jacob? And what exactly made you think I might have survived after you left me to die in the desert?" Jacob's face reddened, but he pressed forward. "I know how it must have looked, but I had to get help. I couldn't protect you against those Apache, so I rode for the nearest fort to bring back soldiers. And it took you weeks to return with that help." Elena's voice was ice cold. "How convenient that you decided to search for me only after ensuring your own safety." Sergeant Mackenzie stepped between them, clearly sensing the tension. "Mr. Whitmore, I take it this lady is your wife." "She is," Jacob said firmly, though his eyes never left Elena's face. "Elena Whitmore, taken captive during an Apache raid 3 weeks ago. I've been working with the territorial authorities to organize search parties." "I wasn't taken captive," Elena said sharply. "I was rescued by people with more honor than my so-called husband." Jacob's expression grew pained. "Elena, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but I've come to take you home to make things right between us. We can start over, put this nightmare behind us." Elena looked down at Citlali, who was beginning to fuss in her arms. Her daughter, who had never known Jacob's touch, who had been born into a world where cowardice and betrayal were foreign concepts. How could she even consider returning to a life built on such foundations? "This is my home now," Elena said quietly. "Citlali and I have found our place with people who understand the meaning of loyalty and courage." Jacob's face went pale as he finally noticed the baby in her arms. "Citlali, Elena, what? Is that our child?" "This is my daughter," Elena said firmly, "born after you abandoned us in the desert. She knows nothing of fathers who run when their families need them most." The courtyard had grown quiet as soldiers and civilians alike became aware of the drama unfolding before them. Elena could feel their eyes on her, could sense their judgment of a woman who would choose life among savages over reunion with her legal husband. Jacob took a step closer, his voice dropping to a pleading whisper. "Elena, please, I know I failed you, but I can change. We can have a real family, a proper home. Don't throw away everything we planned together for the sake of wounded pride." "Wounded pride?" Elena's voice rose with fury. "You left me to die while carrying your child, and you think this is about wounded pride?" Before Jacob could respond, the sound of hoofbeats thundered from beyond the fort gates. Elena's heart leaped as she recognized the war cries that echoed across the plains Kestrel, and the others were coming for her just as Swift Arrow had promised. Sergeant Mackenzie barked orders to his men as soldiers scrambled to defensive positions along the walls. "Secure those gates! Prepare for attack!" But Elena knew this wasn't an attack. It was a rescue. Her Comanche family had seen Jacob's arrival and recognized the threat it represented. They were coming to honor their promise that she would not be abandoned no matter the cost. "Wait," Elena called out to the soldiers. "Don't shoot. They're here for me." Mackenzie spun to face her, his expression grim. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to insist that you remain inside the fort for your own protection. Those Indians out there are clearly hostile." "They're my family," Elena said simply, "and I'm going to them." Jacob grabbed her arm as she started toward the gates. "Elena, you can't be serious. You're talking about choosing savages over your own husband, over Christian civilization." Elena jerked her arm free, her eyes blazing with a fury that had been building since the moment Jacob had ridden into the fort. "I'm choosing people who stand by their promises over a man who breaks his at the first sign of danger. I'm choosing a father for my daughter who will teach her courage instead of cowardice." "You're choosing death," Jacob said desperately. "Elena, please think about what you're doing. Our child deserves better than a life among primitives and heathens." Elena looked down at Citlali one more time, then back at the man who had once meant everything to her. "My daughter deserves better than a father who would abandon her when she needed him most. She deserves to grow up among people who understand that family means more than words." Without another glance at Jacob, Elena turned and walked toward the fort gates. Sergeant Mackenzie moved to block her path, but she faced him down with the same determination that had carried her through childbirth in the desert. "Sergeant, I'm leaving voluntarily. You have no legal right to hold me here against my will." "Your husband has legal claim to you and the child," Mackenzie replied, though his tone suggested he was uncomfortable with the situation. "My husband forfeited any claim to us when he abandoned us to die," Elena shot back. "I'm Comanche now by choice and by ceremony. Jacob Whitmore has no more claim on me than any other stranger." As the gates opened and Kestrel rode through with Swift Arrow and Painted Wolf flanking him, Elena felt a surge of joy and relief that surprised her with its intensity. These men had risked their lives to keep their promise to her, had faced potential military confrontation rather than abandon her to a fate she didn't choose. Kestrel's eyes found hers immediately, and she saw the relief in his expression as he confirmed she was unharmed. But she also saw the concern as he took in the situation. The soldiers with their weapons ready, Jacob's desperate anger, the impossible complexity of her position. "Aiyana," Kestrel said formally, using her Comanche name deliberately. "Are you ready to come home?" Elena walked toward him without hesitation, ignoring Jacob's anguished protests and Sergeant Mackenzie's warnings about the consequences of her choice. When she reached Kestrel's horse, he extended his hand to help her mount behind him, and she accepted it gratefully. As they prepared to leave, Jacob made one final desperate plea. "Elena, if you ride away now, you'll never be welcome in white society again. You'll be marked as a squaw, as someone who chose savagery over civilization. Is that really what you want for yourself and our child?" Elena turned back to face him one last time, her voice carrying clearly across the tense courtyard. "I want to be someone my daughter can be proud of. I want to be someone who keeps her promises and stands by her family no matter what. If that makes me a savage in your eyes, then I accept that label gladly." With Citlali secure against her chest and her arms around Kestrel's waist, Elena rode out of Fort Defiance toward the winter camp that had become her true home. Behind them, Jacob's voice carried on the cold wind, calling her name with a desperation that might have moved her once, but now sounded like the cry of a stranger. As they crested the ridge overlooking the fort, Elena looked back one final time at the world she was leaving behind forever. The wooden stockade looked small and insignificant against the vast expanse of the plains, a tiny island of what white people called civilization, in an ocean of what they called wilderness. But Elena had learned to see with different eyes now. The wilderness wasn't empty. It was full of life and meaning for those who knew how to read its signs. The civilization she was abandoning wasn't actually civilized. It was built on broken promises and abandoned responsibilities. "Are you certain about this choice?" Kestrel asked quietly as they rode toward home. "Once we return to the winter camp, there will be no going back to the white world." Elena tightened her arms around him, feeling Citlali's warm weight against her chest. "I'm certain. Take us home, Kestrel. Take us to our people." As the fort disappeared behind them and the familiar landscape of the high plains stretched endlessly ahead, Elena felt a sense of completion that she'd never experienced before. She was no longer Elena Whitmore, abandoned wife seeking survival. She was Aiyana, eternal blossom Comanche woman and mother, riding toward a future built on courage, loyalty, and the fierce love that had already carried her through impossible transformations. The snow began falling again as they rode into the gathering dusk, but Elena felt only warmth as she contemplated the life that awaited them. Citlali would grow up strong and free, learning to ride like the wind and speak the languages of both earth and sky. She would know what it meant to belong to a people who valued courage over comfort, who kept their promises even unto death. And Elena herself would continue to bloom in this harsh, beautiful land, proving every day that some things, love, loyalty, family, were worth any sacrifice, any transformation, any price the world demanded in return. 5 years had passed since Elena Whitmore died in the desert, and Aiyana, eternal blossom, was born among the Comanche. The transformation had been complete in ways she could never have imagined during those first terrifying days at the winter camp. As she watched Citlali, now called Star by everyone in the tribe, chase butterflies through the tall grass near their summer encampment, Aiyana marveled at how thoroughly their lives had been rewoven into the fabric of Comanche existence. Star was no longer the fragile infant born in desperate circumstances, but a vibrant 5-year-old who spoke Comanche as naturally as she breathed and rode horses with the fearless confidence of her adopted people. Her dark hair flew behind her as she galloped her painted pony in circles around the camp, laughing with pure joy at the simple pleasure of speed and freedom. To look at her, no one would guess she hadn't been born into this life. "She rides like she was born on horseback," Morning Dove observed, using the English name she still preferred despite 5 years of Comanche life. Sarah had adapted to their new existence, though never with the complete transformation that Aiyana had undergone. She remained somewhat apart, accepted, but never fully integrated in the way that Aiyana had become. "All Comanche children do," Aiyana replied, though pride colored her voice as she watched her daughter execute a perfect turn at full gallop. "The horses know they belong together." The summer camp sprawled across a vast meadow beside a clear-running river, hundreds of lodges arranged in the traditional pattern that reflected the complex social structure of the band. Children played between the teepees while women worked at various tasks, preparing food, crafting, clothing, maintaining the tools and weapons that sustained their nomadic life. Men attended to the horse herds that represented the tribe's wealth and mobility, or sat in council discussing the matters that would determine their survival in an increasingly dangerous world. That world had grown more dangerous with each passing year, White settlers continued to pour across the plains in ever-increasing numbers, bringing with them the soldiers and buffalo hunters who threatened everything the Comanche held sacred. The great herds that had sustained the tribe for generations were being systematically slaughtered not for food or shelter, but for sport, and the value of their hides in distant markets. Aiyana had learned to read the signs of this encroaching destruction in the faces of the warriors who returned from scouting expeditions, in the increasing frequency of council meetings that excluded women, in the way conversations stopped when she approached. As someone who had lived in both worlds, she understood the implications better than most of her adopted family. "Aiyana!" a voice called from behind her, and she turned to see Bluebird approaching with her own young son toddling beside her. Kestrel's sister had become Aiyana's closest friend and confidant over the years, the bridge between her old life and new identity. "Singing Wolf wants to see you in her lodge." Aiyana felt a familiar tightening in her stomach. Summons from the tribal matriarch were never casual social calls, especially not in times like these when every decision could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. "Star," Aiyana calls to her daughter, "come practice your beadwork with Morning Dove while I speak with grandmother Singing Wolf." Star wrinkled her nose at the suggestion, clearly preferring horses to handicrafts, but she obediently guided her pony toward the lodge. At 5 years old, she already understood the importance of showing proper respect to the tribal elders. Singing Wolf's lodge remained as impressive as ever, its painted walls depicting the history and spiritual beliefs of the Comanche people in intricate detail. The old woman sat beside her fire, her weathered hands working steadily at a piece of quill work while her sharp eyes tracked Aiyana's approach. "Sit," Singing Wolf commanded without preamble. "We have much to discuss and little time for pleasantries." Aiyana settled herself across from the matriarch, noting the unusual tension in the old woman's posture. In all her years among the Comanche, she had rarely seen Singing Wolf display open concern about anything. "The scouts have brought disturbing news from the south." Singing Wolf began, her voice grave. "A large force of soldiers is moving across our territory, burning villages and killing anyone they find. They say they are searching for white captives, but they make no distinction between those who came willingly and those who were taken by force." Aiyana felt ice form in her veins. She had always known this day might come when her presence among the Comanche would draw unwanted attention from the military, but she had hoped her complete integration into tribal life would protect her family from such consequences. "How large a force?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "3 companies of cavalry supported by Tonkawa scouts who know our ways," Singing Wolf replied. "They are led by a colonel named Mackenzie, a man known for his ruthlessness against our people." Aiyana knew the name. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie had built a reputation as an aggressive Indian fighter, someone who pursued military objectives without regard for civilian casualties or diplomatic niceties. If he was leading this expedition, it meant the army was serious about achieving its goals, regardless of the cost. "What do the war chiefs counsel?" Aiyana asked. Singing Wolf's expression grew even more troubled. "They are divided. Some want to move the entire band deeper into the wilderness to places where soldiers cannot follow. Others believe we should fight, that running will only encourage more aggression. And Ironhawk sees this as vindication of his warnings about harboring whites among us," Singing Wolf admitted. "He argues that you and the child should be surrendered to the soldiers to prevent further attacks on the tribe." Aiyana had expected this development for years, but the reality of it still felt like a physical blow. Ironhawk had never fully accepted her presence, despite her complete adoption of Comanche ways. He had been waiting for an opportunity like this to press his case for her removal. "Would the council agree to such a course?" Aiyana asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the fear coursing through her. "That remains to be seen," Singing Wolf replied carefully. "Much depends on how the situation develops in the coming days." Before Aiyana could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Through the lodge entrance, she could see riders approaching the camp at speed, scouts returning with urgent news, judging by their haste. Singing Wolf rose with the fluid grace that belied her advanced age. "Come, we must hear what they have learned." A crowd was already gathering around the returning scouts when they emerged from the lodge. Aiyana recognized the lead rider as Running Bear, one of Kestrel's most trusted men. His face was grim as he dismounted and strode toward the assembled tribal leadership. "The soldiers are closer than we thought," Running Bear announced without preamble. 2 days' ride at most, moving directly toward our position. They have Tonkawa guides who know this country as well as we do. A murmur of concern rippled through the crowd. The Tonkawa were traditional enemies of the Comanche, and their knowledge of tribal movements and hiding places made them dangerous allies for the soldiers. Iron Hawk stepped forward, his tall frame commanding attention. "How many soldiers did you observe?" "More than 100 mounted troops, plus supply wagons and artillery," Running Bear replied. "They are prepared for a sustained campaign, not just a quick raid." Iron Hawk's gaze found Aiyana in the crowd, his expression holding a mixture of accusation and grim satisfaction. "And what were their intentions if you could determine them?" "They questioned everyone they encountered about white captives," Running Bear said. "Specifically, a woman named Elena Whitmore and her child, supposedly taken by Comanche raiders 5 years ago." The crowd turned to stare at Aiyana, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical pressure. After 5 years of accepted membership in the tribe, she was suddenly an outsider again, a source of danger that threatened everyone she had come to love. "So," Iron Hawk said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered people, "the white woman's past has finally caught up with us exactly as I warned it would. How many of our children must die because we chose sentiment over wisdom?" Kestrel appeared at Aiyana's side, his presence both protective and defiant. "Iron Hawk speaks as if the choice is simple, but it is not. Aiyana is Comanche, now bound to us by law and custom. We do not abandon our people simply because enemies threaten them." "She was never truly our people," Iron Hawk shot back. "She is white, and whites bring nothing but destruction wherever they go. Look around you. Do you see any soldiers hunting for Comanche children among white settlements? This threat exists only because we showed weakness." The argument that followed was both heated and sophisticated, drawing on tribal law precedent and the practical realities of their situation. Aiyana listened with growing despair as she realized how divided the tribe had become over her presence. Some, particularly the older women and those who had come to know her personally, argued for her continued protection. Others, especially younger warriors influenced by Iron Hawk's rhetoric, demanded her surrender to prevent military retaliation against the entire band. Finally, Singing Wolf called for silence. "This matter is too important to be decided in haste or anger. The council will deliberate tonight and render judgment tomorrow. Until then, no action will be taken." As the crowd began to disperse, Kestrel guided Aiyana away from the central area toward the privacy of their lodge. She could feel the stares following them, could sense the whispered conversations that would continue throughout the night. "What will you do if the council decides to surrender me?" Aiyana asked once they were alone. Kestrel's expression was troubled but determined. "The council cannot order me to abandon someone under my protection. If they choose that path, I will take you and Star away from here, find another band willing to accept us, and become outcasts yourselves," Aiyana said sadly. "Kestrel, I cannot ask you to sacrifice your place among your people for my sake." "You are not asking," Kestrel replied firmly. "I am choosing, just as you chose to become Comanche rather than accept the safe path offered by your former husband." The reminder of that day at Fort Defiance brought back a flood of memories. Aiyana wondered what had become of Jacob, whether he had given up his search for her or continued to pursue some fantasy of reclaiming his abandoned family. She supposed it didn't matter now. The consequences of his efforts had finally caught up with them, regardless of his current circumstances. Star burst into the lodge at that moment, her face flushed with excitement from her afternoon's adventures. "Mother Bluebird taught me a new song about the thunder horses. Would you like to hear it?" Looking at her daughter's innocent enthusiasm, Aiyana felt her heart breaking. Star knew nothing of the danger approaching, nothing of the political complexities that might tear their family apart. She was simply a Comanche child, living the only life she had ever known. "Of course, little Star," Aiyana said, gathering her daughter into her arms. "Sing for me." As Star's clear young voice filled the lodge with the ancient melody, Aiyana found herself thinking about the choices that had brought them to this moment. Every decision she had made since Jacob's abandonment had been motivated by the desire to protect her child, to give Star a life filled with love and security. Now those very choices threatened to destroy everything they had built together. That evening, the tribal council met in Singing Wolf's lodge, while the rest of the camp waited anxiously for their decision. Aiyana sat beside her fire holding Star, who had finally fallen asleep despite the tension that permeated the air. Through the lodge walls, she could hear fragments of the heated debate taking place among the tribal leadership. Iron Hawk's voice rose above the others, repeatedly pressing his case for surrendering the white woman and her child to prevent military retaliation. He spoke of the children who would die if soldiers attacked the camp of the horses, that would be lost of the way of life, that would be destroyed by white vengeance. Other voices responded, arguing for the sanctity of tribal protection laws and the dishonor of abandoning someone who had proven her loyalty over 5 years of faithful service. Bluebird spoke passionately about Aiyana's contributions to tribal life, while Singing Wolf reminded the council of the ancient obligations that bound them to protect those who sought sanctuary among them. The debate continued for hours, voices rising and falling like the eternal wind across the plains. Aiyana dozed fitfully, waking each time the discussion grew particularly heated, straining to understand the Comanche words that would determine her fate. Finally, near dawn, the voices fell silent. Aiyana sat up straighter, her heart hammering as she waited for the summons she knew would come. When it arrived, delivered by a solemn young warrior, she kissed Star's sleeping forehead and followed him to face whatever judgment awaited. The council lodge was thick with smoke and tension when she entered. The tribal leadership sat in their traditional circle, their faces grave in the firelight. Some met her eyes with sympathy, others with resignation, and a few with open hostility. Singing Wolf spoke first, her aged voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Aiyana, called Eternal Blossom, you have lived among us for 5 winters as a daughter of the Comanche people. In that time you have proven your loyalty and your courage. You have contributed to our welfare and raised your child according to our ways." Aiyana felt a flicker of hope at the formal acknowledgement of her status, but Singing Wolf's expression remained troubled. "However," the matriarch continued, "your presence among us has now brought danger to the entire band. Soldiers come seeking you, ready to kill anyone who stands between them and their objective. The council must weigh your individual welfare against the survival of our people." Iron Hawk leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with anticipated victory. "Tell her the decision, grandmother. Tell her that sentiment cannot override survival." But Singing Wolf held up a weathered hand for silence. "The decision is not what Iron Hawk expected. By a margin of 1 vote, the council has chosen to honor our traditional obligations. You will remain under our protection, and we will face whatever consequences arise from that choice." Aiyana felt her knees nearly buckle with relief, but the victory felt hollow when she saw the faces of those who had voted against her. The tribe was now deeply divided, and that division could prove as dangerous as any external threat. "However," Singing Wolf continued, "this protection comes with conditions. You and your child will be moved to a separate camp with a small group of volunteers who choose to share your danger. The main band will relocate to a more secure position beyond the immediate reach of the soldiers. Aiyana understood the wisdom of this compromise, even as it broke her heart. The tribal leadership was trying to minimize the danger to the majority while still honoring their obligations to her, but it meant separation from the community that had become her true family isolation at the very moment when she needed their support most. "Who will be part of this separate group?" she asked. "Kestrel has volunteered, as have Bluebird and her family. Several other warriors and their wives have also chosen to stand with you." Singing Wolf's expression softened slightly. "You are not without friends, child, but neither are you without enemies." As the council session ended and the lodge began to empty, Aiyana found herself face to face with Ironhawk. The war chief studied her with eyes that held no hatred, only a cold calculation that was somehow more unsettling. "You have won this battle," he said quietly. "But the war is far from over. When those soldiers find our main camp empty and learn that you have been moved elsewhere, they will not simply give up and return to their fort. They will hunt you across the entire territory, and they will kill anyone who helps you." "I know," Aiyana replied simply, "but I cannot control the actions of others. I can only control my own choices." Ironhawk studied her for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps there is more Comanche in you than I thought. Very well, you have chosen your path. See that you walk it with honor even unto death." As she left the council lodge and walked back toward her own dwelling, Aiyana felt the weight of the decision settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had won the right to remain among her adopted people, but at a cost that might ultimately prove greater than the victory itself. The separation of the camps took place over the following days, with military efficiency. Kestrel led the small group that had volunteered to share Aiyana's exile deeper into the wilderness toward a hidden valley that offered both concealment and access to water. Aiyana watched the main band disappear toward the north, with a mixture of relief and profound sadness, knowing that she might never see many of those people again. Their new camp was smaller and more vulnerable than anything she had experienced since those first desperate days after Star's birth. Only 23 people had chosen to accompany them, barely enough to mount an effective defense if the soldiers tracked them to their hiding place. But as she helped establish their new lodges beside the hidden stream, Aiyana found herself moved by the loyalty of those who had chosen to stand with her. These people were risking everything, their safety, their connection to the main tribe, their very lives to honor the bonds they had formed with her over 5 years of shared existence. "Do you regret it?" Kestrel asked as they worked together to secure their lodge against the evening wind. "The choice to remain rather than surrender yourself to the soldiers." Aiyana looked across their small camp to where Star was playing with the other children, her laughter bright against the backdrop of uncertainty that surrounded them all. Her daughter was happy and safe for now, surrounded by people who loved her and accepted her completely. "Ask me again when this is over," Aiyana said, echoing the words she had spoken years earlier when first choosing to become Comanche, "when I know what the final cost will be." But even as she spoke, Aiyana knew that she would make the same choice again. She had found something among the Comanche that she had never experienced in the white world, a sense of belonging that went deeper than blood or birth, a community willing to sacrifice for its members, regardless of the personal cost. Whatever trials lay ahead, whatever dangers pursued them across the vast landscape of the plains, she would face them as Aiyana, eternal blossom Comanche woman and mother. The frightened settler's wife who had given birth in desperation 5 years ago was gone, forever replaced by someone who understood that some things were worth any sacrifice. As night fell over their hidden valley and the first stars appeared in the clear sky above, Aiyana held Star close and whispered the old Comanche prayers, for protection and guidance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new tests of the choices she had made. But tonight, surrounded by the people who had chosen to stand with her against whatever came, Aiyana felt the deep peace that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged.